Okay, here comes video 2 in Unit 4, the series on the political organization of space. And in this little section, we're going to be talking about how Europeans kind of carved up the world into the political framework that we see when we look at a map of the world today. So remember way back in Unit 1, we talked a little bit about site and situation. Site is physical and it's, the terrain and the climate and the landscape. And then situation, we talked about, what's going on. The site of a place is not going to change, but the situation might. So in this case, Europe was in the medieval period and was not very strong. China and India were far richer than Europe in the Middle Ages. But as European states began to become more organized and as European leaders were visionary and decided to go out and colonize and explore and look around the world for riches and power, the situations changed. And Europe had these comparative advantages. A really, really cool book to read is Jared Diamond, professor at UCLA. He wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. What were the three things Europeans had that allowed them to control from far away vast territories and peoples far flung across the world with these colonies and empires? So the relative location of a state will influence its projection of power. Why is Mexico's economy better than most other Latin American economies? Because they're right next door to the biggest economy in the world. Why is it that California, Texas, and Florida, their economies are so linked to Latin America? Because they're, again, states in the U.S. that are uniquely situated where they're close to other parts of, say, the Caribbean in the case of Florida, or Mexico in the case of California or Texas. So a theorist that comes up with this idea of comparative advantage and comes up with this idea of how states interact as actors in a big, global themed play is a guy named Emanuel Wallerstein. And we'll talk about him in just a second. One thing about Europe, they were dominant until about the time of the World Wars. But the World Wars, remember, most of the fighting took place in Europe. Their infrastructure was shattered. Their populations were decimated. Their economies were bankrupt. When their situation changed, they lost control. India became independent. They started to lose control of their territories on the far side of the world. For Spain, that had happened even sooner. They began to lose control of their empire in the early 1800s. So who fills that vacuum? The United States. The United States becomes a global power post-World War II. And then we get this kind of bipolar Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Today, the United States for a while has been the only global dominant superpower. But again, it could be a multipolar world emerging as we go into the next century. And again, when you look at how politics changes, geopolitics, the boundaries and the borders, most African states were controlled by the French or the British or even the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch. But by the 60s, most African states had become independent. So you can see this kind of post-colonial era. And by this time, Latin America had already become independent. Brazil, of course, being Portuguese, the Portuguese royal family went to Brazil during the Napoleonic era to escape the fighting in Europe. When the king of Portugal went back, his son became the emperor of Brazil. And they had a monarchy for a short time, but then became a republic like many other countries in the world. But by this time, this part of the world had already become independent. Of course, the United States had become independent of Great Britain back in the 1700s. Remember, your second oldest country in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti after their revolt against the French in the 1790s. China, of course, never part of a foreign empire, although some colonial parts of China fell under foreign domination, namely Hong Kong, Macau, which is still under Portuguese control, even places like Shanghai. Ethiopia and Liberia, famously in Africa, the only two African states that never came under the power of a foreign dominating colonial imperial power. Liberia was created by the United States as a place for freed slaves to go back to Africa in a repatriation. That's why the capital of Liberia is called Monrovia, because it was the time of James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States. And of course, the Kingdom of Ethiopia resisted Italian aggression during the 1930s. So this map just kind of shows you the boundaries and the borders. And how, a lot of these different parts of the world were under some colonial imperial power or another. So the other part of this in terms of projection of power is the economic side of it, not just military power, but of course, you got to have money to buy all those ships and planes and guns and tanks and things like that. So when you think about the economic dimension of power, in the world today, you still have this kind of post-colonial, even with, the independence of states, they still, a lot of times their number one trading partners, their former colonial power. The language that they use on a daily basis is often still the colonizers' language, even though they may have their indigenous tribal languages that they speak at home. So we kind of call this time period neo-colonialism. It's a new kind of colonialism where it's economically controlled rather than politically controlled. So where states rank in the global economy is in some ways related to the amount of power that they can project. And this is why you look at China and India. China has already become one of the biggest economies in the world. But although on a per capita basis, China is still nowhere near as rich as European countries or even the United States, Canada, Australia, or Japan. India also a growing economy, but again, nowhere close to the big players in the global economy. So Emmanuel Wallerstein that I mentioned earlier, he created this idea of the world systems analysis, where basically he said that there are three realities. First is that there is a single global market economy. That's his first basic premise, and that every country is part of that single market economy. And that three-tiered economy is the core, the periphery, and the semi-periphery. He says that there's an international division of labor within that three-tiered economy. Some countries in the core are the ones who are the decision makers and the designers and the planners and the marketers and the executives behind that global economy. And then there are some people in that global economy that are the resource providers. They're the growers of agricultural products. They're the miners of resources under the ground. And then there are also those within that three-tiered economy that are the manufacturing part of it. So they're the people that work in the factories and the sweatshops, like in Southeast Asia, and what China used to be in terms of the world's factory. Everything seemed to have been made in China. That's changing today. But basically, Wallerstein says that since about the 1450s, the age of colonialization and the age of exploration, the world has pretty much been like this, a three-tiered system of core, periphery, and semi-periphery. So think back to when I showed you the video that Hans Rosling did about Don't Panic. And remember I told you about how Hans loved to show the world as kind of three income levels, that you had those that were living on $1 a day, and those living on $10 a day, and those living on $100 or more dollars a day. This is kind of that idea of core, periphery, and semi-periphery, where the $100 people would be in the core, the $1 people would be peripheral, and the $10 people would be semi-peripheral. And remember, the vast majority of the world today is in that $10 semi-periphery level in terms of population, because you'd put most of your Chinese population there, most of your Indian population there. You're already over 2 billion at that point. And then, of course, remember a lot of countries like your BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Mexico, Turkey, South Africa, all Indonesia. These are all countries that would be in that semi-periphery level. So if you look at Wallerstein in terms of a visualization, you kind of look at the core countries that make a lot of money off of the consumption of goods and services. You think about an Apple iPhone. It's a perfect example. The periphery is going to be the source of the raw materials. The semi-periphery is going to be where the labor is going to be making the iPhone, but the people that are going to be consuming the iPhone and buying the apps and playing the video games and downloading the music, that's going to be people in the core. Another way to show core periphery is in networks, and certainly social media is like this as well. And remember, there's a huge part in David Palmer's Blue Book in this unit about networking and how people can be involved in networks, and that's very hierarchical. So a lot of the global economy is hierarchical, where people that are in the core kind of manipulate and control the people who are in the periphery and in the semi-periphery. This is kind of just an idea of showing you what the core periphery looks like in a global sense. Certainly the United States and Canada as Anglo-America are very wealthy. Western Europe, not so much Eastern Europe because that's the formerly communist part of the old Soviet Union and their satellite states. Japan included in that core, and don't leave out Australia and New Zealand, also very wealthy, very European-based cultures. But who would be then the semi-periphery? Again, your BRICS, Brazil, kind of Russia, India, China, increasingly Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, growing economies, the Middle East, rich with oil revenues, places like South Africa, places like Turkey, even countries like Nigeria are modernizing and developing and growing their market economies. Mexico, again, close proximity in terms of situation to the United States. And a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada also boosts their economy. So Nigeria, a country that I just mentioned, and I also talked about it very little bit at the end of the first video in Unit 4. When we talk about core periphery, an important thing to remember about Wallerstein is that it's interchangeable at scale. You can look at the core periphery arrangement globally, but you could also look at it within a country. Nigeria has three famous core areas: the Hausa-speaking Muslim population in the north, the Yoruba-speaking area of the southeastern part of the country, and the Igbo portion under the old capital, Lagos, where you had this next power core. And Nigeria, since 1960, had struggled to keep the country together as a unified nation. People didn't buy into being Nigerian. They said, well, I'm Hausa, or I'm Yoruba, or I'm Igbo. What does it mean to be Nigerian? And the country, at one point, moved the capital. It's a forward thrust capital, leaving the old city of Lagos and going to the new capital city of Abuja. And it was in the center. And the whole idea here was trying to get people to buy into a centralized government in Abuja that would be for all Nigerians. What's interesting is that to this day, one of the things that makes Nigerians most Nigerian is the soccer team, the Super Eagles. Whenever Nigeria does well at international competitions, you see that the couple 100 million Nigerian people are super happy and super proud to be Nigerian. So this kind of sectional division has been solved to some degree by buying into a common identity and moving the capital into the middle of the country. But this is a good illustration of what we mean by core areas. In the United States, what would our core area be? Is it that Bosnia-Wash corridor, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., where so much of our governmental and financial decisions are based? You could also argue the United States has multiple core areas. The area around Los Angeles, big population in California, certainly where our TV and movie and radio multimedia kind of emanates from. Is it Chicago, the industrial area around the Great Lakes? Is it the growing southeastern United States, the new economy of the South, Atlanta and Charlotte and Nashville and big cities there in the deep South? So when we think about core periphery, be able to change scale. If we change scale and look at Florida, is South Florida that core area? Probably so. Could it be that I-4 corridor that kind of connects through Orlando to Tampa? Probably not the area of Tallahassee, even though it's the capital. I'm not sure you would argue that that's the core area of Florida. You know, you get up in the Panhandle, you're kind of like in South Alabama. So think about core periphery. Think about how it relates to political geography. We'll be back with video 3 shortly.